Okay, good afternoon to everyone. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Raquel Hill from University of Indiana at Bloomington. So, go ahead.
Thank you, Elisa. Today I'm going to talk about plug-and-play trust for embedded communication systems. So there's always a lot of information in the title. So we're going to start by trying to, understand exactly what, I'm going to talk about just by looking at what's going on in the title. So the first thing that hits you is the notion of plug and play. And we always, given all the technology today that's plug and play, we're looking at something that's going to be automatic. So, when you're using these services that this work provides, we're looking at automatic trust, okay? We're going to actually break down the whole notion of what trust is, a little bit later in the presentation. But the other important thing to look at is that we're talking about embedded systems. And specifically, we're looking at communications between embedded systems. So when you're thinking about the type of systems that is being discussed or looked at in this work, think about a remote system where you want to verify the integrity of what's actually going on in the system. So when we're looking at trust, we're looking specifically at integrity-based trust. So whether the system state is in a configuration state that is equal to some pre-agreed upon certified state. So whether this certified state is trustworthy is outside of the scope of the work that we're looking at here, because that's a whole nother area of work to determine whether the system is in a trustworthy state. But here we're just looking at trying to verify the integrity. So we've agreed upon a set of criteria that constitute what we consider to be trusted state that can be certified by a third party as being trustworthy, and how to determine trustworthiness is outside of the scope of the work, but integrity is what we're looking at for trust. So certified integrity is what we're looking at here. So, and we want to be able to have a system and a platform that will do this automatically for us. Okay, so what is trust? So there are basically two different types of trust that we're looking at. One is the social trust that is based on the reputation and recommendation of the system, and the other is behavioral trust. Is that, can you prove that you meet certain criteria? And as it relates to this work, this criteria goes back to some pre-certified state, and that's the criteria you need to be able to prove that you meet. So that goes back to the integrity. And so what we're looking at here is more of the behavioral trust, and as it relates to the integrity of a system. But when we begin to talk about the hardware that we're using in order to facilitate this evaluation of trust, what we're going to see is that we also have to rely somewhat on social trust, because social trust in the vendors that are actually developing this hardware. So you can't get away from the social trust, but what we want to do is the behavioral trust and focus on the proof. Okay. So the behavioral trust expounded is basically just looking at, this notion of certified trust or integrity based trust. And so trusted doesn't always mean trustworthy, because that's a whole nother area of work. And trusted doesn't mean that there are no flaws. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So we are looking at something that is going to give us an automatic evaluation, of our notion of trust. Trust means integrity, and something that about a pre-certified state. Okay. Okay, so I have these blank screens here just to let me know, like, I'm transitioning now to the next topic. So we're going to look at the problem and motivation for this particular work. So why is it that I want to look at this problem of evaluating the integrity of a remote system? What we're finding now with the proliferation of malware, that systems are being compromised. We have systems from ATM machines, we have our routers, our infrastructure being compromised, electronic voting systems being compromised. And so there's a need for just to evaluate the state of the system. Is the system in a state that I expect it to be in? And so this is what this work is actually looking at, and so compromise of such systems can really affect our faith in, these large area systems, especially when we're looking at things like the power grid, our banking institutions, and they may not just have a local effect, but a national and even an international effect on our trustworthiness of these, on our sense of trustworthiness of these systems. So that's why we're looking at this particular problem. And this problem became really interesting to me when I was reading articles earlier this year about the compromise of ATM machines. So earlier in 2009, there were some Eastern European banks that basically detected that their ATM machines contain malware that actually copied the magnetic strip of ATM cards. And so what would happen is that when the hacker actually came up and inserted a MasterCard, what he would get is all the receipts of all the ATM magnetic strips that had been copied. Okay, so, if we had a system in place where we could evaluate the integrity of, the software that's loaded on an ATM, if a banking institution, before it would actually process a request to, withdraw money, evaluate the state of that ATM and deny the request if the software that's running on the ATM is not what it expected to be, we could reduce the effects of compromised machines. Okay, so this is helps to motivate why are we actually concerned about the integrity of these systems. So our research question is how do I establish trust of a device that may be reconfigured? Reconfigured to provide a different set of functions. And, whether it's reconfigured intentionally or unintentionally. And how can we establish, evaluate, and maintain platform integrity? And so platforms perform as specified or expected. So expected here just means that you're running the software that I expect you to run, but doesn't necessarily say anything about whether this software has bugs or there are flaws or anything like that, but this is the expected software suite that that is expected. So the proposed solution is to use trusted computing platforms to enhance the security solutions and to evaluate integrity. So how many of you actually are familiar with trusted computing platforms in the room? Show of hands. There are a couple of you. Okay, I have sufficient background to begin to help you to understand like what a trusted computing platform is and how it can actually be used. Okay, so trusted computing technology is technology that allows a platform to give unforgeable guarantees about its configuration state. Okay, so what that actually says is that I want something that's unforgeable, which implies that there is some type of digital signature, okay, that's being used. So you got a hardware platform, you have a separate execution environment that's separate from the host that this chip is embedded in. It has its own separate storage. It also has its own identity-based cryptographic key. So you're using some public key cryptography here. And the private key is stored within the device itself. You will release the public key to some entity that can certify that this public key is associated with this particular trusted platform module. Okay, so we have this, so that's what makes it unforgeable. So how do we actually try to forge this? Then you have to go and tamper with the hardware to try to extract the keys. Okay, but you have an isolated software environment that no one is able to download code to the device in order to change the way the device interacts with the host machine. So the host here can make a request of the device, but it can't really dictate how the device responds. So it can't, try to forge something on behalf of the device because the encryption keys are stored within the device. So when you're thinking about a trusted computing, module, it has those particular characteristics. And so typically a server obtains guarantees about the state of a remote client with regards to this integrity measurement, and it relies on cryptographic keys that are held, within the hardware itself. So, these are the main characteristics of trusted computing. Not trustworthy because we haven't evaluated the trustworthiness, but trusted in a sense because we have this isolated execution environment, and the only way you can access the keys is that you tamper with, that information. Okay. Trusted computing platform, and so we talked about, this is in the form of some built-in hardware. The trusted module is used to create a foundation of trust for the system. So your foundation of trust is not necessarily in the software, but in this hardware component. So that constitutes part of what would be your trusted computing base, along with any other software that you rely on, the basic security functions of it. What's interesting about the trusted computing platform, I think around 2002 or 2001, 2002, most laptops were being shipped with a trusted platform module embedded in the laptop. Now, they were not active, there were no applications to actually use them, but they were actually being embedded in the particular laptop, and just for future use. If we look at the research that's currently being done in the US, it has really lagged behind what has been done in Europe. And most of this has been because researchers have been very suspicious about, what are we going to use this module for? Is industry proposing this so that they can have a way of controlling my system? Do I own the software? Do I own the control of my system? Or is that being controlled by the operating system? So, embracing this technology has lagged behind, in the U.S. The U.S. has lagged behind embracing this technology than Europe. So there's far more research going on, with the use of this technology in Europe as opposed to the U.S. And it's just because of that issue. And I think Richard Stallings has a quote about, trusted computing not being trusted or trustworthy, but treacherous because it could be used to control a system. And it's not very easy to actually use this to try to do something like force you to run a specific software stack before your system boots. And I think that was the scare of, how this technology could be used. So there's been this lag. Although the trusted platform modules have been available in your laptops and home computing devices, for a while. So your home machines and most oftentimes that's where you'll find them, in your large gaming machines that are being, designed for home use. And so it's very understandable why people are very suspicious of, this technology. Why, why is it actually being put in these devices? But the way I see this, technology is not to be used for the evaluation of home computers, and we'll get into why that is, but just the evaluation of infrastructure that is more static, than your home system. When you look at your software stack for your home system, there's a lot of diversity there. There's a large code base, there are many options for drivers and things like that, and it makes the use of this system, for integrity-based measurements very challenging. So we have about 50% of laptops today have trusted platform modules, and we can expect that there will be 100%. When we look at the applications that utilize the trusted platform module now that are on the market, I think BitLocker is one. To use the TPM to actually encrypt your hard drive. And so that's about that's the only one that I can think of, how it's actually being used today. Okay, so we talked about a trusted computing platform and what it is. I introduced the term trusted platform module and talked about how these are stored in your laptops. But actually what a trusted platform module is it's a chip that has its own CPU. It has some specific cryptographic functions like does SHA-1 hashing, key generation, and RSA encryption. So before I talked about, I have this remote system and I want to measure its integrity. So what an integrity measurement is basically a hash of each file that's loaded, into memory as part of your software stack. You can also hash any configuration files. Okay, so when it says that when I make a statement and I say that the TPM is measuring my system, basically that measurement is being initiated by your BIOS, your basic input-output system, and it measures itself, and then it loads the next piece of software and it measures it. So what you get is that from the BIOS on up to your applications, each layer is actually measuring the next thing. That information and measurement is basically just taking a hash of the executable or asking the TPM, hey, hash this for me. The TPM then stores that in one of its platform configuration registers. So in addition to having a CPU, some specific functions that are implemented, you have these platform configuration registers that act as storage where you can, it's the length of a SHA, of the output of a SHA-1 hash, which is 20 bytes. So basically you use that to store your measurements. Now when, the proof comes in, and when we talked about behavioral trust, basically you proving that you have a certain, running a certain software stack is basically having the TPM sign these measurements and then send them off. So a remote request will come into a host and says, give me a quote of what's running. The host has to ask the TPM to basically sign these measurements and then give it to it and they'll pass it out. Because the signature is not forgeable, then the remote entity knows that this information has come from this particular TPM. So that's how it works. So it's not like the TPM has any control over your system at all. Your booting policy is just based on what you decide to boot. Now, you can lock down some specific files on your system so that you cannot access them unless you're running a specific software stack. So let's say that you've encrypted some files and you've said that I only want to be able to decrypt these files if I'm running this particular configuration. And if I'm not, then my system has been compromised and I don't want to be able to access the system. You can implement those types of things, but that's based on, whatever policy you institute. It's not like the TPM controls your machine. It's basically a tool that can be utilized, to evaluate the integrity of the machine. Okay, are there any questions? All right. Let's see how we're doing on time. We're doing pretty good. So your trusted platform module basically can securely report the environment that it is booted into. It can securely store data, securely identify user and system, because you have a cryptographic identity called an endorsement key that's stored within the TPM, and you can create multiple identities from that trusted identity. So those identities can be stored in encrypted form on the host, while your basically storage root identity is stored within the TPM, and it can be produced inexpensively. So those are some of the design goals and characteristics of the Trusted Platform module. So we talked about, the TPM being like your root of trust and your foundation of trust. So there are two types of roots of trust within, the trusted computing area. And one is the root of trust for measurement, and there's a root of trust for reporting. Okay. What you will want is that both of those to be embedded within the TPM. Your root of trust for measurement, becomes your, like your BIOS, because it's initiating the measurement. your root of trust of reporting actually is the TPM itself, because it is responsible for signing and protecting any data. So the signature and the signing is done by the TPM, and it's the entity that's going to be responsible for reporting what your state is. Okay, the host itself forwards the report or the quote from the TPM, but the host cannot construct this, this measurement. Okay. So in a TPM, in a PC, the root of trust for measurement is your entire platform, because as you go up to the stack, each entity is actually doing the measurement, and your BIOS becomes like your core root of trust for measurement. It's the thing that initiates it. Okay. And I think that's basically what this slide is saying. The first software is run during the boot process and is preferably located in the Trusted Platform module. The reason that you want it located within the Trusted Platform module is that you don't want there to be compromise to this particular piece of software, because you have to trust it. So if it's on the host and you can actually change the BIOS, then, you have a problem here, So the BIOS has to, if it's within the TPM, then, it's not in an updatable form and you're not expecting it to change. Okay. So that's why they say preferably we would want it inside the TPM. Yes?
Just had a quick question. So
yes.
If a malware tries to install on the operating system,
yes,
how does the TPM verify whether it's an authentic software or not?
So what they have is there is an integrity measurement architecture that's part of the operating system. So each time some piece of software wants to be loaded into memory, the operating system will ask the TPM to measure it. Okay? So then that actually changes your integrity measurement. Okay? Now, a remote system that has asked you for a measurement previously will have the old measurement. So what you will want to do is periodically request a quote. So in the example I gave you earlier about the ATM, so you could request a quote each time someone enters an ATM card and ask for a transaction. That may be too frequently. You may not need to do that if there is a long line of people continuously asking for it. You can do it periodically, every hour or, every so many minutes or whatever. But each time, the operating system is loading something new into memory, it would ask for, a quote. Okay.
But during installation time, there is no way of checking the integrity, is it?
So during installation time, when you're first booting up, so let's say you have a new boot process, you're loading things into memory, and what you're loading into memory becomes that current state of the system. Now you could have your BIOS, you could embed information and say that this is what you're supposed to be loading. So this is a hash of what you're expecting to load, and then the TPM measures it, and you can compare what is measured to what you have. So if you have a specific policy that says do not load this software unless it matches it, you can do an integrity measurement up the chain. You can do it that way if you want to enforce some type of secure booting, meaning that I will not boot unless I boot into a specific state. Which is different from trusted booting, which says this is my software stack and I trust it because it is equivalent to some pre-certified state. So, that's how, if you want to do it on initial boot, you need to have some idea of what is expected. So secure booting versus trusted booting. I stop, in the case of secure booting, I will not even boot. I will not continue the boot process because this particular file doesn't meet the criteria for a secure boot. Okay. Let's see. We talked about the TPM, storing the measurements within the platform configuration, and it assigns measurements to ensure, the integrity of the measurements and reports them to trusted parties. Now, when I say report them to trusted parties, I've spoken about this just a little bit. The TPM is not talking directly to a remote party. It's actually being mediated by the host. but the host cannot make changes to the measurement that the TPM has because it doesn't have the private key and doesn't have access to the private key and cannot change it. Okay. All right. So this gives you an example of, your trusted boot example of a measurement chain. And we talked about the BIOS, doing the initial measurement, and the BIOS basically then measuring the master boot record, and that, measuring the grub loader, and that continually going up the stack to the operating system, and then the operating system measuring whatever applications that are to be loaded. Okay, so when you think about this and you think about an OS like Windows, that's a lot of code. And what we found when putting together this plug-and-play trust system is that, what we did to reduce the amount of code diversity is basically create a static image. So when you're measuring a large image, it actually takes the TPM a very long time to do that calculation. So one of the things I'm going to, hopefully I get to in the future work is talk about, are there, OSs that we can use to reduce the size of our static image so that this, we can make the process quicker. Okay. So when we think about the, what does a trusted computing platform offer us, there are a couple of things. So what we get is secrecy because, we have the storage of data and code basically in a vault, basically a locked space. Because the key that's protecting the data itself may be stored in an encrypted format on the host, but the key is stored within the TPM. Okay. We have the authenticity. Basically, the code proves itself via the use of a sheltered key, because now I can determine that the key that was used to sign the data and encrypt the data is stored within the TPM, based on my public key certificate associated with this particular device. Okay, and the TPM's endorsement key is actually signed by the vendor and things like that. So, and after we verify the software that's running on the system, then we can provide authenticity of data. So this data was created, on this system that was running a particular software stack. So we can tie the data to a particular version of a software stack and say, okay, this data is protected. Okay. Okay. So some of the challenges to using the TPM. So as I said before, that the research using the TPM in the U.S. has lagged behind other countries. So we don't have all the tools in place to actually, make use of a TPM readily. Okay. What we do have is a lot of tools. We have drivers that have implemented some of the specific interface functions for interfacing with the TPM, but we don't have something that will actually do our attestation functions, our remote attestation, the verification functions, and the applications that are actually going to utilize those functions. And so this is what this particular work addresses is, do we have just our basic platform that we can, we can start doing the research without even worrying about how do we bring all of these tools together and actually to create, a platform that can evaluate the integrity of a remote entity. Okay. And so there's a steep learning curve, because you have to find, what driver works with which OS, and, this just becomes, just a systems kind of nightmare. It can, you can hit a lot of stumbling blocks with this. And like I said, no application that provides attestation service, but, our system, the plug-and-play trust system, actually, it has that system in place. So you can do remote, you can ask for a quote remotely. It will provide you with, an attestation signed by the TPM, and then it verifies the TPM signature. And in addition to that, what we provided is like a firewall service that will open up a port on a firewall based on the integrity verification of the remote entity. So it's like, I won't even communicate with you if you are not running, you know, the expected software. So this is what this particular work, you know, does. And the whole problem of code diversity. Code diversity, you know, is a big problem. And so when you look specifically at code diversity, basically Windows installation loads like 200 or more drivers from a known set of 4 million drivers. Okay, this is a big problem. When you think about the TPM being used for integrity verification, okay, because we don't know what trustworthiness means. We need to do some research to understand whether this software stack is trustworthy, whether we, you know, how do we measure, you know, trustworthiness of a software stack. That's its own research area. But when we look at, you know, integrity verification, one of the things, when you have 4 million possible drivers, you know, how do you determine which map into a set of trustworthiness? You know, this becomes, you know, a big problem. So this code diversity problem is a big issue. There's also a lot of operating system state, so with regards to configuration files. So Windows performs 20,000 to 50,000 registry reads during the booting process. Okay, so this is a big problem, and the state information is not useful if the configuration changes after the measurement. So if you have these changes going on, this becomes a problem. And so that's why we were looking at taking the approach where we have a static image, a read-only image that we're not expecting it to change. So if there is any changes that are going on in memory, you know, we can detect what's going on. So we define what is trustworthy. We limit that. We allow you can, even with the plug and play, you can drop other applications within the system and make it a part of your static image, but you know specifically what you're running on. So that's the benefit of, you know, having like this plug and play system. It builds the system for you. Now, whether that system is trustworthy, that's another issue, but you know, you don't have this problem. We've gotten rid of the problem of code diversity. There's some related work on this by St. Clair et al. And it's called ROTI. It's a root of trust of installation. And what they use a virtual machine along with this static image to actually do this. But we're not using a virtual machine. We're actually using VM-Knoppix and the other TPM tools to actually do something, you know, that's similar. And we're adding the secure communications channels using the TPM, you know, and its private keys, the keys that are protected using the TPM to establish that secure communications channel. So our, you know, our cryptographic keys that are used for, you know, communication and establishing the secure channel are not stored openly on the host. Okay. So with PlugNPlay Trust, the goal is to enable remote parties to verify the integrity of embedded communication systems, thereby limiting the effects of malware in a compromised system. So we just want to limit what malware can do. If we detect, we may not be able to detect it early enough that, you know, there isn't some vulnerabilities to compromise, but if we can detect it, at least we can identify that this particular machine has a problem, and you can deploy someone to actually go and address, you can shut down the system, you can ignore requests from that system, and those are the kind of things that you want to do to be able to limit it. You know, okay, this system is compromised, but our entire system won't be compromised. And this is specifically important if the malware is using the network of nodes to propagate itself, you know, throughout a whole banking institution, you know. So this becomes a problem. So if we can limit the effects of the compromise, you know, we may not be able to prevent it, but we can detect and limit, and that's what we're trying to do. So the system provides remote attestation. And we didn't create TPM. We did not create, you know, the interface to the TPM. Those tools were there. But what we did do was integrate those, you know, and provide a remote attestation application, the validation application, and the firewall service at the application level that utilizes those things. So, and in the secure communications channel, we have OpenSSL actually integrated with the TPM. So those are the things that we've actually, done. So you are not concerned about your keys being stored on the host in an unprotected state. So when we're looking at trusted state, to trust a system means to trust all the files on that system, including binary and configuration files. For a system to be trusted, it must be identical in every way to a predefined trusted baseline. So this is certified trust for integrity purposes. So that's, that is what we are trying to achieve here. Okay. So how we're actually doing this is that we use a trusted platform module as our hardware notion of trust. Okay. It gives identity verification and remote attestation support. So when you look at the TPM, one of the things that is easily used for is for identity verification. Basically, I have a cryptographic identity and endorsement key that's stored within the TPM. I can create multiple other identities. The vulnerability is that if someone gets hardware access to the device and they open it up, they can gain access to the keys. And when you look at earlier versions of the TPM, you could actually reset the TPM just with a wire. And so those issues were addressed in later versions. So in 1.1, it actually had, that particular issue. Like, how can I, if I can easily reset the TPM, then that makes the keys in itself vulnerable. And so those problems were addressed in like version 1.2. So those were some of the earlier issues that we had. So the other approach was to integrate TPM tools, OpenPTS, which is some work out, I think it's out of Japan. Trousers is work that's done by the Trusted Computing Group. And the integrity measurement architecture is used, in order to enable like the TPM communication. So these things we did not implement. But what we did was we used those to facilitate the attestation service and to request a quote meaning a measurement, and to also request to validate a quote. So those were the tools that we used, but first thing we had to do was just integrate this and get it all to work. The only other, I teach a class in trusted computing at Indiana University in Bloomington, and so what we've been lacking is just a platform to actually do this kind of research. And so there is like a trusted computing emulator, but some of the work has not, it doesn't implement the full specification, the full TPM specification. So some functionality was not there when I tried to use it a couple of years ago. So actually just having this in place, becomes very helpful, because now we can look at, what types of problems can we address without having to be concerned about, do I even have the basic platform to just do this kind of research and evaluate the things that I'm doing. Like, even if I have, let's say for an example, an electronic voting system, where I'm relying on, let's say for an example, it's written in Java. So now I have to look at the Java runtime environment. What does it mean to actually take a measurement of that? Can I efficiently do this in, using the TPM? I can't even answer those questions if I don't have the basic platform that I can readily use. And this is what, the plug-and-play trust allows us to do. So, and we use live CD technologies, VMNopics, to create a read-only system of the certified distribution. And basically, reason we did the read-only, because we didn't want to have to address the code diversity problem, and what we envision with embedded systems is that the software stack is smaller than on our regular laptop. So one of the problems that I was talking with today with Dr. Bertino is being able to ask the question, can I trust my own laptop? I can't answer that question. I want to be able to answer that question. Can I answer that question with a trusted platform, using a trusted platform module to measure the integrity? I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because the system is so large. There's so many things that are changing, you know, and is a change malicious, or is a change acceptable? That is a very hard problem when you're dealing with the amount of code and the amount of things and the amount of state that can actually change. But those are some of the things that I would like to do. Now, there is some work in the area of like attribute-based attestation. So what that does is, what you try to do is map this larger set of state into a smaller set, into some specific attributes. And then you measure the system based on the attributes. And there are a couple of, there's more work in this area, but it's really at the beginning stages to try to address the code diversity problem. Okay. So what we provided basically are like, you know, four things. We have a PNP, a plug-and-play quote daemon, which responds to remote attestation requests with a signed quote from the TPM. And so this is all happening at the application level, utilizing some of those services we talked about with TPM tools and things like that. We have a PNP trust verifier that verifies this quote, you know. We have the firewall exception service, which basically opens up a port on a firewall to establish that secure communications channel. And we have the secure communications channel using the secure socket layer and utilizing the TPM, you know, and its protected keys. So now we're not allowing the keys to be openly stored on the host. Okay. So when we look at this particular this figure, and it's probably, I apologize because I know the words are not, you know, large enough. So this is how we see this interaction, you know, occurring. So you have your plug and play embedded services user, and you have the provider. So the provider is actually going to evaluate, you know, the remote user or the remote entity. Think of this as an ATM. So the ATM here requests and embedded services on a particular port. So this is a well-known port that's available. And so the firewall exception service, so that port is not available, you know, it's closed. And so the firewall exception service on the server is going to say, okay, well, tell me what you're running. Okay, what is your state? You know, basically give me a quote. The TPM then has to construct this quote based on the measurements that are stored in its platform configuration registers. So then that's where the PNP quote daemon comes into play. And the TPM, the host says, TPM give me a quote gives it to the host passes it on back, you know, to the server. So the quote info and basically a nonce for freshness. So embedded in the quote is a nonce because we want to know that this is actually a fresh quote. And so the PNP trust verifier will then validate. So what you have on your server end is the expected hash sequence for this remote entity. So you're storing that, and this is already embedded, you know, in your read-only image. And so you have that a priori stored there. So once it verifies, you know, that quote, then what you get is access granted or access denied message that goes back. And if access is granted because the quote was verified, you get this, you know, your trusted communication can be established at that point. And we're using the OpenSSL, you know, to establish that. And so that's really how the service works. Now, to actually set this up, you know, all the details are actually, you know, provided in the paper that we have under submission right now, and we'll make a available one, you know, via our technical report service, so you can see exactly, you know, how things are set up. But, you know, available on the website, it's my website. It'll be, if you go to www.cs.indiana.edu /RalHill/PNP Trust, and that was in the, I think, the announcement that they put out. You can actually, you know, create a thumb drive with everything on there now. So we have everything. You can download it. There are instructions on how to actually set this up, and you can, just create the thumb drive and boot your whatever, your laptop, your desktop, or whatever, using this particular system. So it's using, a Linux, based operating system, and all of the services are actually available there. So. Let's see, I think I only have about, 6 minutes. So, I'll talk about, what we want to do for future work. And, if you have any questions and, some of the, talk about some of the major challenges, that we had. So with regards to the contributions, part of this process, it was a big engineering, process. Really, that took about a semester just to get everything integrated, just to figure out what the problems were, why we couldn't talk to the TPM, which drivers actually did what, collecting tools from multiple sources, having the right OS that supported those tools. So getting the right BIOS that, that had the communications to the TPM embedded. So a lot of this was an integration problem, And so once we got over that task, then it was, now that we have the system in place, what are the services that we needed, additional service that we needed in order to facilitate this communication and allow us to verify the integrity of the remote system? Okay, but the biggest part of it was integration. Part of it was even finding the right OS such that the image wasn't so large that it didn't take forever to actually do the measurement, So that took a bit of time too. So there were a lot of challenges. And so now, you guys, if you want to use this, you don't have to suffer, that way, because we just have a step-by-step process for you just downloading, everything that we have and just creating this thumb drive. And so we developed a platform for trusted computing research that integrates existing device drivers and new application level of remote attestation, integrity verification, and trusted communication services, including the firewall service. And one future goal is to reduce the size of the file system image to support services for embedded devices that have limited storage. So we're doing all of this on, right now we're doing it on desktops and things like that. But, for smaller devices, we would need a smaller image. And we're looking at some Debian Linux in order to do that. And another goal is to, where the real research comes into play, is evaluating the trustworthiness of a system. How can we do this? Can we define some specific attributes that will allow us to map this large code base into a smaller space and do measurements on those particular attributes? That's where the interesting research lies in this area. It's like, I have this predefined state, but can I say anything about the trustworthiness? And how do I measure, trustworthiness of this predefined state? Now, when you're looking at entities or infrastructure components that are controlled by one particular entity or a part of an autonomous system, this is not a specific problem, because maybe they have in-house certification, they've already evaluated the software, they know exactly what the issues are. But if you are an entity that's trying to determine whether you're going to let this remote party host your data, your applications, how are you going to determine whether they are in a trustworthy state or not? You need some way of doing that. They can tell you, well, I'm running this certified code, but do you trust the software stack? Are there vulnerabilities? How often has this particular software stack or elements of the software stack been compromised? So that's where the interesting, work lies here. What we did was put together the platform so that we can readily begin to investigate, the more interesting problems. So I think I have about 1 minute and 10 seconds. And so if there are any questions about, any of this, I would definitely.
Is it possible for the host to fake what it sends to the TPM in some way. So maybe the TPM is looking for a configuration file and needs to make a hash of it and sends it off to the server for verification. Can the host, the host has control over that configuration file, so it can pretty much send maybe a valid configuration.
And so that goes back to the question before, how do you, when you're initially booting the system, how do you verify the integrity of what's actually being loaded, okay? So let's say, for an example, that you're not at each step verifying the integrity of the layer that you're loading, okay? So you're not evaluating that. So the, the grub loader is not evaluating the OS. And the OS that you load is compromised, then everything, your security is gone out the window at that point. So if you have specific policies, about, that state about what that software should be at that layer, you can do the enforcement there, because where your assumption of trust comes into play is at your BIOS. So you're assuming that that is trusted, okay, and trustworthy. Now, if it is somehow compromised, because it is not in the TPM, everything goes out of the water there. But if at each layer, the layer below it, at the preceding layer, evaluates the integrity of what it's loading, then you can control, compromise entering at that point. So you're correct. If you're not doing that kind of strict evaluation of what you're loading, you can load something malicious, and then that malicious layer can hand off anything else. So, that becomes the problem. But you will want to evaluate that as you're loading it. Yeah.
My question would be regarding the trusted module. What is actually preventing me from emulating the whole trusted module from the host system itself?
So one of the problem that how do I begin to detect that you're actually emulating and you're not the real TPM? Okay, has to do with the actual key itself.
I mean, let us say that I have not had any prior communication with the remote server that I'm thinking of establishing a communication with.
Okay.
And I emulate a completely new TPM with a new set of keys.
And if you get a certificate authority to certify that this key is associated with the TPM and this is a real TPM, but the TPM's endorsement key itself is certified by the vendor. Okay. So that's where you get in. That's where you remember when I talked about this whole notion of social trust. Okay, your social trust is relying on the vendor. So the vendor is included in this verification chain based on its certification that this public key, private key pair is for a TPM that I created. So any identity key that's generated has to then be, signed by this particular key. So you create a key chain. So that's what prevents you from just saying, okay, I'm just going to be my own TPM. I'm going to emulate all this functionality. Is because you're relying on the vendor, to provide a level of certification for that chip.
And I just had another question. You had also said that every time an OS loads, the state is first recognized by the TPM and then it's allowed to load. Now, you said that this state would also depend on the policies that have been preset, because what are the applications that will be loaded with the application is dependent on the policies. So now, let us say, I have a keylogger. Let's keep it as simple as that. And there is a policy which says that load this application. The policy engine basically doesn't know anything about it. It just thinks that this is another application that we loaded with the OS. Now, wouldn't it make sense to separate the policy engine from the host or from the TPM so that it's more secure?
To separate the policy engine from the TPM and from the host so it is more secure. Okay, so I think I lost, you said that the policy engine doesn't say anything about loading. It just says, let's say, for example, I'm trying to understand your question. Let's say your policy engine says that load every application.
Oh, no, the policy engine doesn't know that, this is a keylogger which is basically malicious. Neither does TPM. But the TPM depends on the policy engine basically to verify any new application that is supposed to be loaded with the operating system. So considering that you have changed the policy engine, which is a part of the host now, and the TPM trusts the policy engine for the keylogger to be loaded, wouldn't it make sense that the policy engine is separated from these two so that even that could be trusted?
Okay, so so let me ask this question. So are you saying that we have a policy engine that's a part of, let's say it's a part of the OS?
Okay.
Okay, so the policy engine is a part of the OS. And are you saying that your policy engine is compromised somehow?
It could be, yes.
Okay, so let's say your policy engine is compromised. And so that means your OS is compromised. Okay, and now you're just loading keyloggers and your system is in a compromised state. Now, in the example of remote verification, a remote entity can determine that, okay, if it's requesting quotes from you and it has some predefined state, it can determine that you're no longer running what you expect it to run. So you can verify that, but what you cannot verify locally is that you may be in an untrustworthy state. Now, if I said like your policy is embedded within those software stack, at each layer you know what you're supposed to run. Now, you would, before your loader loaded your OS, there's a part of the policy engine in each layer, so it knows what it expects to load. So you shouldn't, if you have a specific policy on which OS to load, you shouldn't load the compromised OS. So that becomes, part of the issue, because you have what is constituted as a trusted entity loading an untrusted, something that is not trusted. Okay, so then that becomes the issue. I don't think you have not the full policy engine in one particular piece, but there's a piece in each layer to tell it what your images look like that you're supposed to load at this point. So that's where it's not all in one particular place where the OS controls everything that should be loaded. But once your OS is in a compromised state, then you have a problem, and you won't be able to detect that until some remote entity verifies the integrity of the system.